Well, some men are made of earth and sand, and some men are made of wood. Some men feel like they're made of steel, and that's all well and good. This bloke's made of sterner stuff, just short of sainthood.
Colin McCahon is New Zealand's most important painter. Today, his major works sell for millions of dollars. But during his lifetime, he struggled to earn a living for himself and his family. Illness stopped him painting in 1982. His last works were not discovered until after his death in 1987.
When my father died, on the day he died, we all gathered here at this house, the family home, and my brother William and I felt compelled to go walking up and look in the studio up here. No one had been in there for years. It had been absolutely forbidden to the family to intrude there on my father's workspace. We wanted to get back in touch with Colin, our father, the Colin, the painter, the person we'd known, not this husk that had just died. So we went up with the key, feeling a bit wicked, and unlocked the door and opened it. And there, down below, on the floor, spread out, was a canvas face down. So William picked it up, and that was the last painting, as we call it. And our reaction on seeing this was really overwhelming, and we were rather in despair about it. Reading the words, we were quite overcome, and to feel that possibly this had been how our father had been feeling about the world, about himself, in those last days when he was painting, was just too much.
I counted the dead happy because they were dead, happier than the living who were still in life. More fortunate than either, I reckoned man yet unborn, who had not witnessed the wicked deeds done here under the sun.
This bleak text is from the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. Some viewers believe that the words express McCahon's own loss of faith in humanity, and perhaps even God. Others see it as a continuation of his lifelong mission to provoke us, to think about our own moral, ethical and spiritual values. No known film or video footage of McCahon exists, partly because he wanted his paintings to speak for themselves.
I think he realised that he had the goods, but at the same time he was very modest. He didn't ever want his photograph taken because he didn't want the people in the local dairy to know who he was. He wanted to work away quietly and sincerely on his work.
Because he's never gonna play it safe. Gonna be a question of faith.
Colin McCahon was born in 1919 in his grandmother's house in Timaru. The family grew up in Dunedin, and the three McCahon children were encouraged to draw and paint and go to art exhibitions.
Colin at that time was very much an admirer of the Cubist style, and I can remember our father particularly arguing that that's not art. He thought of art as being our maternal grandfather's watercolours. But Colin used to reply, there was no need for it after the development of photography. We've got to do paintings for other reasons, paintings that will inspire thought in people, putting up new ideas.
And in the pub, farmer, miner, mill hand, labourer and clerk all meet to quench a summer's thirst. On Sunday there's church.
In the late 1930s, McCahon was a part-time student at the Dunedin School of Art. He became friends with Tos Wollaston and a small band of like-minded individuals. Tos Wollaston's landscapes were viewed as radical in what was then a very conservative society. Few artists followed international trends in contemporary art. In 1939, McCahon started to create his own style. From the beginning, a spiritual dimension was central to his work. He wrote to Tos Wollaston about an early painting of the Otago Peninsula.
I imagine people looking at it and then looking at the landscape and for once really seeing it and being happier for it, and believing in God and then the brotherhood of man and the futility of war and the impossibility of people owning and having more rights to a piece of land and air than anybody else.
Between 1939 and 1945, 135,000 New Zealanders went to World War II. Colin McCahon failed the medical tests necessary for service and spent the war years working as a labourer and orchard worker. The orchards were in Nelson, and Tos Wollaston's batch at Mapua became a centre for debate amongst Colin McCahon's growing circle of friends. These included Doris Lusk, Rodney Kennedy, Ron O'Reilly, Alsby Forsyth, and the young artist Colin would later marry, Anne Hamlet. Global depression and World War provoked discussions about politics, fascism, pacifism, religion and art. Mainly they talked about a distinct New Zealand art which broke free from European traditions.
What artists seem to do much more than doctors and chemists is actually explore things relating to people's thinking, what they think of themselves in relationship to their environment and other people, and what is getting some sense of what's inside them. People like Rodney and Colin bicycling from Dunedin up to Nelson to work on the tobacco fields, on things, had all this time for looking and thinking and talking, and that's, I'm sure, how a lot of these ideas sort of formulate.
In 1942, Colin McCahon married Anne Hamlet, one of 6 children of the Anglican Archdeacon of Dunedin and his wife Ellen. In Anne, Colin McCahon found someone who was sympathetic to his pursuit of art, an occupation which was then widely considered unsuitable for a family man.
We as children, we all grew up feeling we were what was called working class, but in fact they were middle class people, both sets of parents, and the expectation would be of something more white collar in work rather than the sorts of things that Colin was doing, and he really was a bit of a vagrant. And I think for Anne to launch herself into this lifestyle, well, okay, it was pretty brave.
One of their wedding presents was a book, Geomorphology by Professor Charles Cotton. McCahon loved it because it conveyed the underlying structure, the bones of the landscape.
I loved his drawings for the way they told about things. I've since then constantly referred to Cotton to explain what it is I've actually seen.
In the period following the end of the war, Colin McCahon started to re-examine Christian themes, inspired by his love of Renaissance painting. He started to experiment with placing these same biblical stories in a contemporary New Zealand landscape.
In these pictures, he's trying to get to the essence of something. He's also aiming for a particular modernity, a kind of a contemporary feel. So, for example, in a painting like this one, the Crucifixion according to St. Mark, you have elements of pop culture, if you like, the comic book, speech bubble, but also, as McCahon said, it was taken from the packet of Rinso, the old soap powder. And you also have other great elements in this picture, the cathedral that's been struck asunder by the lightning bolt. But the most important thing for McCahon was that it was in a contemporary situation. This is Nelson. This is like the Nelson Hills, and it's New Zealand in the 1950s, with McCahon looking in. The portrait, the artist looking in on the right-hand side, something also taken very much from Renaissance painting. There were a few people who understood. Amongst the few who did was the young James K. Baxter.
I think you put on the canvas something I know about New Zealand but have not learned to say. The raw vitality and brutal simplification.
In his painting from 1948, The Promised Land, Colin McCahon includes himself as a workmanlike painter in a black singlet. As Moses had led the Jewish people to their promised land, so New Zealand could be a promised land to colonial settlers. The artist, any artist, but in this case Colin McCahon, could play the role of a prophet, one able to lead or point out the way that New Zealand was supposed to be seen. An angel hovers above announcing the title. Most viewers did not understand the Christian symbols and allusions McCahon used in this painting.
This was the first of several occasions in McCahon's career where the work that he had produced failed to get through to his audience. His audience didn't understand, and each time he was forced to reappraise what he'd been doing and examine whether there might be another way that he could get his message through.
McCahon's next approach in the early 1950s excluded religious figures and tried to convey the spiritual power of the unspoiled and uninhabited New Zealand landscape. 6 Days in Nelson and Canterbury is one of Colin McCahon's most important works. In a sense, it is a summary of all his earlier landscapes. It is a record of his spiritual relationship with the land, inspired by the trips he used to make from Dunedin through Canterbury to Nelson, often on a pushbike in search of seasonal work. The painting can be viewed on different levels, recording 6 variant forms of landscape, as well as alluding to the 6 days of the creation. The blood icon in the centre refers to Christ's sacrifice on the cross. McCahon wrote to his friend, John Castleberg.
Something's been worked out at last, and I can now make a start in a new direction.
Up until this time, McCahon's main income had been from labouring, not painting. He had been forced to travel to where the work was, and the family, which now included 4 young children, had often lived apart from each other for long periods.
They talk about him being so poor. Well, I don't think, from my point of view, that was not quite true. Colin had a house, he had a garden, he had all those things. And when things got tough, he went back to Dunedin, or Anne went back to Dunedin with the kids.
Despite family's support, it was hard for a family man to be an artist. In 1951, he was to get the help he needed from an unexpected source.
Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I am. Our boy McCahon's picking fruit on a farm on a warm autumnal day. No bugger gives a toss, so he bears his cross and just keeps chipping away. Forget those quotes from the Holy Scripture, doesn't even look like a bloody picture.
In 1951, Charles Brash paid for Colin McCahon to take his first trip out of New Zealand to Melbourne. At this time, his Canterbury landscapes reflected his renewed interest in Cubism. In the National Gallery of Victoria, he met the elderly Australian painter, Mary Coburn Mercer. She had lived in Paris in 1908 and had witnessed the beginning of Cubism. McCahon took lessons from her.
It had to be about something, and not just a vase of flowers, or a landscape, or a portrait. But there's another layer that has to go into painting before it ticks over. Something you can't explain, and I don't think should be talked about, actually, by anybody. And Mary Mercer never violated it, that you mustn't talk about what you're doing to other painters and other people. They have to make their own discoveries.
In 1953, Colin McCahon moved to Auckland on the understanding that he had been offered a job at the Auckland City Art Gallery by the gallery's director, Eric Westbrook. He arrived to find no such job existed, but Westbrook employed him as a cleaner until such time as he could become an attendant at the gallery.
The gallery, when I first arrived, was really a mausoleum. I think the paintings had been hung in the late 1800s and they hadn't been touched. Dusted occasionally perhaps, but hadn't been touched for 50, 60, 70 years. And Eric Westbrook changed all that, and of course he needed McCahon to help him bring the change about. And I made my contribution too when I started, because I was McCahon's little factotum really.
But no matter what the artist thinks about his own or a fellow artist's work, the public is the main critic. and the public, wisely or otherwise, likes and buys the lifelike portraits, the recognizable still lifes, and the familiar landscapes that this year, as always, form the bulk of the Academy's selection.
The good old days of 1950s New Zealand were very much at odds with McCahon's plans to drag the gallery into the 20th century.
With McCahon's arrival and the sort of program he wanted to set in place, and you know, it was soon made known that McCahon and Westbrook wanted to get rid of the Art Society and the Fellowship of Artists. There was it was a hostile reaction, and McCahon was very unpopular with quite a few of the art crowd in Auckland.
Some of these pictures are quite good, aren't they? I had a brother who wanted to be an artist. He didn't like the idea, though. I always think artists and that sort of people are a bit crazy, don't you?
Colin was now 35 years old. The gallery was his first regular full-time job. Often during the past 11 years of marriage, he had been forced to live apart from his family by the need to get paid work. Now he was able to buy a house and return home every evening. Not that it was easy.
We came to Auckland in 1953 and lived in Titirangi and a tiny house at French Bay. For the first month, we lived almost entirely on a diet of potatoes, parsley, and bags of rock cakes given by a kind and ancient aunt.
Today, if I'd seen that house as it was in the 50s, I'd probably been a bit horrified, but back then it seemed to be very novel and romantic to me. I mean, a house with no walls in the downstairs bedrooms for the children. It was minute. And when Colin was painting on the floor, I often watched him paint. When he was painting on the floor after dinner at night, I mean, there was just no room for anyone else to do anything in the house. So it was a very difficult situation for the family.
Grandfather Hamblett was not pleased. He was not pleased with the way that his daughter and her children were being looked after. And I actually remember him castigating my father about this, and in fact chasing him around with his umbrella, which was pretty scary. I was out on the deck and the craze was the hula hoop, and I counted to over 1,000 hula hoops while this was going on because I didn't really know what to do.
In Kauri, a painting from December 1953, McCahon takes the old Cubist idea of incorporating collage of posters or letters and manages to meld it into the tree trunks. In this image, the letters A and M are hidden in the Kauri forest. But shortly thereafter, barely 3 months later, the letters come out of the bush and stand on their own in this bold image from February 1954 called I Am. Echoing the words from Exodus where Moses asked God, "How do I identify you to my people?" And God says, "I am, that is who I am."
The I of I Am refers to the God of the Old Testament. But it is also possible to read it as Colin McCahon's assertion of himself as a painter and as a creator. The artist must believe in himself, often in the face of incomprehension and mockery. In 1956, under a new director, Peter Timaru, the Auckland City Art Gallery pushed forward with an ambitious exhibition schedule. In addition to his now permanent position on the staff, Colin McCahon was tutoring at the Art Gallery's art education program and teaching courses at summer schools.
What was the age mix of the...
It was completely people over 80, right through to, younger people. There were sort of old ladies there, sort of no old men. But there were people who were just curious. They were interested in art. They just wanted to get into contact with it and have. They knew Colin was someone worth really to be reckoned with, and they felt privileged, I think, to be, taught by him. And we all knew what he was doing because we could see it, And he kept saying, "Well, one day the balloon will go up," as if the whole thing will be understood.
Remember one particularly poignant moment, we were having to separate Colin McCahon and Peter Timaru rolling around the Peter Torrey's office floor trying to murder each other. And we were just before we were about to open a poetry reading at the New Zealand Festival of the Arts. I opened the back door of Peter's office, which went out to Albert Park, and pushed them both out and locked the door on them. I don't know what the row was about. Peter told me years later it was a row about some record, some rhythm and blues record or something. I couldn't remember the title, but I actually suspect it was an argument about buying New Zealand art, because Peter told me he was not very good at that.
In 1957, Peter Webb launched Auckland's first dealer gallery in his caretaker's flat at the top of Argus House in High Street. An early show was Colin McCahon's Titirangi landscapes. None sold.
At the time, there really wasn't any audience for contemporary art. Certainly not willing to part with cold hard cash. No, I think people who were friends with artists like Colin at the time either expected to be given paintings, just in return for their support, their moral support, or had paintings made available to them for, pittance. I mean, a few guineas they would spend, but the idea of spending £10 on a painting there was not a popular idea at all.
In 1958, McCahon received a Carnegie Fellowship to study art gallery practice in the United States. He and Anne travelled for 4 months, absorbing the experience of a new country. McCahon was particularly impressed by the large-scale works of Jackson Pollock. Works like Autumn Rhythm were so large that viewers had to walk their length to see them and experience them properly. He was also influenced by the way that Hans Richter hung his work free from any supporting picture frame. Returning to the confines of Auckland was a difficult adjustment.
We went home to the bush at Titirangi. It was cold and dripping and shut in, and I had seen deserts and tumbleweed and fences and the Salt Lake Flats. My lovely Karis became too much for me, and I fled north in memory and painted the Northland Panels.
McCahon's trip to America gave him the confidence to work on large-scale, unstretched and unframed canvases, arranged singularly or in sequences. In the Northland Panels, the treatment of the landscape is now on a grand scale. The painting style has also changed. Loose gestural brushstrokes and free-flowing writing replaced the tighter, more controlled lines of his earlier Titirangi landscapes.
He painted those in 3 ways. They were draped over things, they were draped over tables, they were flat on the floor, and they were pinned on the walls. So he was at them and from all angles, really.
In one of the panels, McCahon expresses his concerns about New Zealanders' complacency toward the land they live in. A landscape with too few lovers. Northland is depicted as raw, eroded, and unloved.
The Northland Panels represented a major new kind of development in the way McCahon was portraying the New Zealand landscape. In these pictures, McCahon was forcing people to walk along the length of them in order to appreciate them fully. These weren't polite things for hanging on living room walls. They were paintings that were almost an environment. They were almost theatrical.
The dynamics of Colin's painting was that he always started the movement of the brush, if you like, outside the piece of canvas or the piece of paper. So the gesture began before it hit the image.
You don't paint paintings to hang them up with frames around them. The frame is necessary frequently to hang them up with, but it's not part of the work. It's not part of the story. And I think they can be dispensed with.
What about protection?
Protection, yes. If you are foolish enough to go to an exhibition and buy one, then you probably want to put it under glass or do something with it, put a frame around it. But that's not part of my job. And I've started to paint my signature, which everyone wants, you see, on their painting, right at the very bottom or up the side or right at the top, to make it virtually impossible. They lose the signature if they put on a frame. Serve them right. Really cunning.
After the large-scale Northland Panels, Colin McCahon began a new series, inspired by his rereading of the biblical story of Elias. The Elias series is about Christ's final words on the cross. Was Christ calling, Eloi, Eloi, my God, or, as onlookers thought, had he been crying out not to his God, but to the 9th century BC Hebrew prophet, Elias? And if he was calling for Elias, did it mean that Christ had at the last moment lost faith in his God and reverted to an older Jewish prophet? For Colin McCahon, the account opened up the theme of doubt. Doubt on all levels. Doubt in God, doubt in oneself, and ultimately the doubt that can be the death of faith. The Elias paintings are dominated by words. For the first time, an entire dialogue is recorded in each painting, with an emphasis on certain words, phrases, and letters. The Elias series was exhibited in Christchurch in 1959. They were challenging to the small audience who saw them, and few sold. Over this period, McCahon experienced continued hostility and lack of understanding towards his work from the New Zealand public. His family in particular was subject to mounting persecution from some of the local Titirangi community.
There were people who were adversely against him and his work. We as children were okay for a while, but then in those last years, from 58 through to when we left, we had a really hard time, and we had a lot of acts of violence against us, of abusive language, having stones thrown. I had 2 incidents where I had stones thrown at me. William rescued me on one occasion and got hit on the head with a piece of timber with a nail in it.
In 1960, the McCahon family left Titirangi to live in central Auckland. The move brought about a radical change in Colin McCahn's subject matter.
Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I am. The next showdown's in Auckland town with a wife and kids in tow. At least he's got a job, but the angry mob are doing a no-show. To a normal man, this kind of jam would be a body blow.
In the early 1960s, most Aucklanders still regarded art as a leisure pursuit for amateurs, but the opening of The Gallery by Don Wood in May 1960 finally gave artists a professional place to exhibit and sell their work.
I remember Colin, we visited with Upper Titirangi, and we came back with probably 20, 30 works. Probably about $30 million worth of works or more, which we had in our sort of storeroom, our basement storeroom. We had the Northland Panels, of course. The very first show we actually had was the Northland Panels, both the panels and the drawings that went with it. Once again, I think we were largely talking to ourselves. Those who knew the gallery existed and bothered to come, obviously were greatly impressed. But I can't say that we set the world on fire. We didn't set anything on fire in those days.
This was a time of experimentation. He was changing the sorts of paints he used, experimenting with the new water-based paints, discovering all sorts of strange things that happened if you mix them with other things. The miracle of masking tape, that was a new thing that happened then, about 1960, 61.
The plains of inner-city factory roofs surrounding McCahn's new home provided a new motif and subject matter. A key work is Here I Give Thanks to Mondrian.
This picture belongs to a whole lot of paintings that were, believe it or not, based on the landscape that I saw through the bedroom window. The words, Here I Give Thanks to Mondrian, reflect my admiration for the gentleman.
Dutch artist Piet Mondrian was a purist abstract painter. Mondrian imposed rigorous constraints on himself, using only primary colours, black and white, and straight-sided forms. McCahon wrote,
Mondrian was about good and evil, very much. What soul has ever reached purity? St. John on the Cross, even. Allied
to Here I Give Thanks to Mondrian were the series known as Gates. These paintings reflect his personal concerns about the then very real fear of a nuclear war. The words were supplied by his friend, the poet John Castleberg.
He was interested in political events. He was interested in the news and those sorts of things, but he wasn't political. He never joined a political party or any of those sorts of things. His politics were his painting, I imagine, and that was enough.
The gates use dark shapes, juxtaposed against one another to suggest obstacles, while the spaces between them imply a way through. Finding the way through could be applied to the looming threat of a nuclear war, as well as to the impediments of daily life.
These visionary and prophetic painters, they often haven't got good news. You know, can you look really around the world and say, boy, there's a lot of good news in the way human beings behave? I don't think so.
McCahn's response to the confused reaction to this work was that he had failed to communicate his ideas clearly enough. It had misfired because it was too abstract.
The scale and ambition of Gate 2 was McCahn's largest public statement yet. However, he failed to reach the audience that he was seeking, and this failure precipitated somewhat of a crisis of confidence for the artist.
His solution was to return to a landscape he knew and loved, Northland. He took the simplification of his earlier Otago landscapes even further, using generalised forms, the curve of a hill, the line of the horizon, to suggest the underlying spirit of the land.
He was absolutely blown away by it. He was blown away by all that Northland thing, that far north Parenga-ringa and Ahipara and the big sand hills at the mouth of the Hokianga. All those things became very much, very important to him spiritually. And he became interested in this whole idea of the Māori spiritual path, where the spirit moves up, out to Spirit's Bay and then onward to Hawaii.
The real far north of New Zealand is unlike any other part of the land. I can't talk about it, I love it too much. You bury your heart, and as it goes deeper into the land, you can only follow. It's a painful love, the love of a land. It takes a long time.
Another familiar landscape inspired Colin McCahn's next series, The Waterfalls. In the catalogue of his 1972 survey exhibition, McCahon wrote,
The waterfalls started flowing in 1964 and there were hundreds of them. I look back with joy on taking a brush of white paint and curving through the darkness with a line of white.
Your paintings have always reflected a black and white, dark light image. Do you see New Zealand as a land of contrasts?
Very much.
Is this as
incredibly? You can't escape it, of course, it's there. So it must filter through into things, but I don't consciously ever strive for the New Zealand light. It's just so beautiful. That's all. You can say such a lot with it.
Mm-hmm.
That is if you're not one of the fools who regard black as something other than colour. If you regard it as colour, it's superb colour.
The waterfalls were popular, although there was no guarantee that the buyers understood their message concerning the sanctity of the land. McCahon said,
Once painters were making signs and symbols to live by. Now he makes things to hang on walls at exhibitions.
Might as well be hung for sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I am. Now will the cultural cringe or the lunatic fringe be the death of cold? Or will supply and demand in this promised land soothe his mortal soul? No point in being a second stringer. Give the madding crowd the finger.
By September 1964, Colin McCahon had left his position at the Auckland City Art Gallery to teach full-time at the Elam School of Fine Art.
I think most students were immensely impressed by him. There were some students who found the Christianising and the death obsession somehow appalling or embarrassing, but most students, I think, were impressed. He gave you the impression that it was going to be a hard road to hoe, there was going to be no money in it. He also, maybe this is not quite what people would imagine of him, he did say on several occasions that he thought he should be driving a Rolls-Royce. So it wasn't that he thought it was necessarily a good thing there was no money in it, he was just facing the fact that at that time there was no money in it.
To know that there is somebody who, to some extent, understands you and is there for you, it really matters, you know, especially in the early days when you're heading out and you have to summon all the courage you can, and you have to have that faith, you know, because painting is a question of faith. It's painting itself is a question of faith.
I heard Colin being challenged by a student who I think had had too much wine to drink, and I walked over just to see if I could be of any use to anyone. And the conversation I heard is worth repeating. The student was saying to Colin, "For Christ's sake, Colin, painting's over. Film is the art of the 20th century. It moves. It's a moving image. Painting's had it. It's still. It doesn't move. It's yesterday." And Colin looked at him for a while and he said, "Painting's not over. Do you know why?" And the guy said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's still. It doesn't move." And I thought that was pretty sharp.
Well, I think the 60s were quite different in that teaching younger people, they're inclined to find him an approachable person, and they would come to our place, and there was always a lot of people visiting. And it also affected him in that it brought about an increase in his drinking of alcohol, because people would bring a bottle of wine, and there was always a key in the door.
Barry Lett opened a gallery in 1964 in an attempt to promote more contemporary New Zealand art.
It was our intention to try and introduce perhaps a New York style gallery with a new sense of professionalism into the exhibiting scene, and all the artists in the stable at that time were personal friends, and we used to actually sit around and have the equivalent of a board meeting, and we would say that this is what we're trying to do, and the artists would tell us what they wanted and what they were trying to do. And it was a very, very cooperative situation, and we all knew that it was a pioneer scene.
Barry Lett Galleries was it. So every 2 weks? Every 2 weeks there'd be this turnaround, and every 2 weeks was something utterly riveting. And it was as if the whole of Auckland was there for the opening. So we waited with incredible anticipation for these exhibitions, whatever they were. And when it was Colin McCahon seeing his paintings for the first time was just, well, it's just stunning, and what a privilege. The freshness of it, the challenge of it, it's so challenging. And here he is throwing something else at us again to reel away from and think, oh, whoa, what's going on here, you know?
In Colin McCahn's next series of paintings, Numerals, he moved away from any hint of a pretty landscape. He restricted his palette to black and white and filled the canvas with numbers. At almost 9 metres long, Numerals creates an environment for the viewer to walk along, opening with the almost total blackness of a void and concluding with a panel flooded with an inviting white light. Numbers dominate the human channels of communication, and in Christianity, numbers have multiple meanings. The Trinity was read as three parts of the whole: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
The audience for McCahon was very small, and you had people who had, in a sense, made the conversion to his work and were great fans, and they were delighted with them. In fact, the fact that they were pretty tough paintings was an advantage, or seen as a quality. To other people, they were just totally baffling, and we had some amazing reactions to people who weren't Colin McCahon fans, in fact were very antagonistic, and on occasions I had catalogues ripped up and thrown at me, and you know, all sorts of reactions like that. People coming in off the street would just stop and look around and say, well, where's the exhibition? You know?
Well, actually, I still can't understand why people don't get it. I mean, his work to me is just so clearly authoritative and real.
And of course, financially, it wasn't very rewarding at all. In fact, we had financial difficulties all the way through. From time to time, we thought that we were over the difficult part, and then suddenly sales would dry up again for another 6 months, and we would go back to depending on people like Colin to leave money in the gallery to just get us through the bad periods.
All my memories of Colin are of a fairly focused, singular, driven individual. I always think with Colin that with him and the pursuit of his art, it was total war. The drive, the ambition, and I don't mean worldly ambition at all, I mean the ambition to do things on a scale and to touch in areas of the human heart that may be unfashionable or out of sync, but the ambition to do it was total.
From November 1965 to May the following year, I worked on painted glass at the convent chapel in Upland Road for the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions. The east wall above the altar occupied me for the whole of November and December, day and night. Archbishop Liston and I had a real go about the painting and the right order for the panels. We argued for hours. Finally he left saying, "Have it your way if you must." I stayed on and repainted all night to have it his way. He was right. I just had to think harder.
He certainly got more and more involved in talking to priests about this Catholic religion as part of his exploration for his commission, but also for his own personal self. At one stage we were quite sure that he was going to be converted. And then I heard that there were certain mysteries or beliefs that were just too much even for him, such as the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. However, I also have heard, this is that in fact his questions were too much for the Catholic Church, and they said, no, we don't want you. That they wouldn't accept him.
McCahn's renewed interest in Catholic symbols established a new direction in his painting.
The reconsideration of the biblical story of the 14 Stations of the Cross, which McCahon reread in preparation for the Upland Road Commission, meant that in fact he was suddenly found himself presented with a new motif. And it was a motif that was to occupy him in one way or another for the next 10 years of his work. In this work, 14 Stations of the Cross, every station is represented in a spare landscape, a cleft, a hillside, a river, a waterfall, standing in for each of the events of Christ's final journey.
Would you call yourself a religious man?
I would think so, yes, but not necessarily Christian.
When you talk about religion, I assume you're talking about a certain spiritual...
It's an attitude, I think, isn't it?
Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I Am. The days slip by out of Muriwai in a haze of booze and verse, while in town, the thumbs point down, things just go from bad to worse.
In 1969, Colin McCahon built a new studio at Muriwai, a beach community on Auckland's west coast. An inheritance received by his wife Anne, combined with the fact that he was earning more from the sale of his paintings, meant he could stop teaching and establish a studio away from home. For the first time, he had the space to work on single, large canvases.
The landscape is wild and beautiful, empty and utterly beautiful. It's the coast the Maori souls pass over on their way from life to death.
McCahn's interest in Maori culture increased when his first grandchild, combining Maori and Pākehā lineage, arrived in 1969. The same year, his daughter Catherine gave him a book, The Tale of the Fish, Maori Memories of the Far North. The author, Māteri Kiriyama, recounts the genealogy, stories and history of her tribe Te Aupori in the early 1900s.
From August to October, I struggled with Mrs. Kiriyama's lark song. I loved it. I read the poem out loud while I painted, and finally the little lark took off, up the painting and out of sight. The words must be read for their sound. They are signs for the lark song.
He was most interested in Ratana faith, and he was interested in reading what he could about Ringatu and about Te Whiti, the prophet himself, and his views and his pacifism. And from all this, his interest in Māori grew and expanded his ideas of spirituality, I think, but also made him confront his Christian spirituality.
McCahn's next major work was titled Practical Religion, The Resurrection of Lazarus, showing Mount Martha.
After Lark Song, I got into reading the New English Bible and rereading my favourite passages. I rediscovered good old Lazarus. Now, this is one of the most beautiful and puzzling stories in the New Testament. Like the Elias story, this one takes you through several levels of feeling and being and hit me bang at where I was, questions and answers, faith so simple and beautiful and doubt still pushing to somewhere else. It really got me down with joy and pain. I really enjoyed painting it. This took a monumental time to paint and gallons of expensive paint. It is in one way a dismal failure, and in another, one of my best paintings yet.
Practical religion's themes of faith and doubt were explored simultaneously in Victory Over Death too. A simple I am at first, but not so simple really, as doubts do come in here as well. In Victory Over Death 2, McCahon deals with Christ's own doubts as he journeys towards his death. Visually more dramatic than anything else he had ever produced, Victory Over Death 2 opposes a questioning and doubting, am I, with a bold and assertive, I am. With part of the former phrase painted black on black, and thus almost impossible to reproduce, it is only in the painting's presence that the viewer becomes aware of the full power of its questioning darkness.
What did you gain spiritually from the Bible?
Well, a story like that one.
Do you see it as
it's all a matter of faith. That's about all you can say, isn't it?
They were such profound statements that people realised when they saw them that these were masterpieces of Colin's production, possibly of his whole lifetime. These were going to be some of the best work that he'd ever done.
From late 1972 through to 1974, the deaths of a number of people close to McCahon influenced his painting, including his old Dunedin friend, the poet James K. Baxter. Although they had been early confidants, McCahon and Baxter had become estranged during the 1960s. But in 1973, McCahon spent time reflecting on his old friend's life and trials in New Zealand. A key work from this period, and one of Colin McCahn's masterpieces, is Walk, Beach Walk, C1. It overlays Christ's last journey with the Maori tradition of the Spirit's path along Muriwai Beach. The various panels also depict the tides, mist, weather patterns and changing moods of the landscape. Colin McCahon imagined accompanying Baxter's soul on a last walk along the beach shore. Viewers make the same imaginary journey as they walk along the painting.
My impressions of the walk painting are very, very emotional. I had not seen the walk painting until it was exhibited in Gates and Journeys. I may have seen bits of it, but I hadn't seen the whole thing, and I just burst into tears because I had done that walk with my parents and I knew the phases of the beach. I knew about the different sorts of weathers and lights that came in, and it just brought it right back. It was so evocative. And I could make that journey again in my mind with that painting.
Continuing his observations of the Muriwai coast, Colin McCahon was inspired by young gannets about to make their first flight from their colony. The cliff that was their protection now became their impediment. They had to jump before they could fly and survive in the world. Their predicament had such rich associations with the human condition. The landscape forms of the cliff and the island could also be abstracted. The paintings also referred to the need for departing spirits, having flown to Cape Reinga, to jump into the hole in the seabed, which according to Maori belief was the entry into the next world, Hawaiki.
The jump painting is about when the spirit going north to Reinga meets what has become my necessary protection symbol. What does he do but jump? It's all serious, but funny too.
The years between 1975 and 1977 were busy. The family moved to Crummer Road in Grey Lynn. McCahon had 2 major survey shows and several commissions. New Zealand was also in a state of flux and transition.
1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want the nuclear war!
Around this time, McCahon painted the series Teaching Aids.
He and my mother were most interested to go along to the open day at Elam School when Matt was a little boy there. And they went along to the school and visited and went in all the classrooms. And I thought, well, here we are. There they were ostensibly looking at class programs and what was going on in classrooms, but in fact, there was a whole lot of information going in visually with my father and going alongside other sorts of information he was picking up from shop blackboards where they were advertising fruit and vegetable prices and things like that.
They are cold and distant and talk about the Stations of the Cross. I think them beautiful. They are white on black and hack out numbers where the horror falls. I think these very good, but they are so very, very sad. But the occasion was too. Oddly, I'm not a sad person. Maybe this is why I do so many sad paintings. I'm aware of the sadness.
You don't have to believe with McCahon, but you have to understand and appreciate the kinds of questions that he was asking and be prepared to accept that, these were matters of life and death for him.
In the painting, A Letter to Hebrews, McCahon takes his text from the New Testament. And what is faith? Faith gives substance to our hopes and makes us certain of realities that we do not see. All these persons died in faith. They were not in possession of the things promised, but had seen them far ahead, and hailed them, and confessed themselves no more than strangers or passing travellers on the earth.
Fix your eyes on the great I am. TV, newspaper, return the favor, and the PM washes his hands. When he and Cole are dead and that's all she read, there'll be a multitude of fans. Critics, meanwhile, try their hardest to crucify this lone piss artist.
In the last few years of the 1970s, Colin McCahon was unwillingly thrust into a media circus. In 1978, the presentation of Victory Over Death 2 by the New Zealand government to the Australian government unleashed a storm of unprecedented public ridicule. The media in both countries lampooned the gift in cartoons and questioned the artist's talent, integrity and sanity. It also provided endless column inches, airing the views of those who believed their 5-year-olds could do better. New Zealand Prime Minister Muldoon was quoted as saying that he gifted the painting because he knew that it would be controversial. He wanted to draw attention to his initial negotiations for the closer economic relations treaty with Australia. If this were not enough, an offhand remark by a Lower Hutt City councillor, Chen Weri, spiralled into a national news event, mocking McCahon.
Chen came in and, it was a bit of a setup, but essentially he said, look, I could do that in my lunch hour.
Oh, well, I thought they tried to make me into a clown. I think I won in the end, though.
How did you win?
By the final remarks that I made when we were all examining my monstrosity. What do you think of it, Mr. Weri? And my reply was, look, it's absolutely without any artistic merit whatsoever. I think it's quite a suitable picture for the art gallery.
There would be times when he would become really frustrated and cross about something. Who knows? Someone said something in a paper, whatever. And he would drink too much, drink to excess. He would maybe play his Hank Williams record loudly, much to the annoyance of others, or he might up and go out the door and take off and go for a wander.
Rita Angus, the writers, Jim Baxter, Dennis Glover, Toss Williston and McCahon as painters. They were the examples that I had to go by as a kid, and then growing up and entering into this field myself, you see. And they were all people who had gone it alone and who had met with tremendous challenges, one way or another, economic, social. They were in another world, and they'd accepted that. That's the message that I got, that these were people who had bought the whole package. This is their life, this is their vocation, and it meant certain things. And if you're going to live that, if you're going to choose to be an artist, this is the deal. It's tough.
At the time, McCahon wrote,
"All the news that broke in the papers had been hanging around my neck since last September. I just couldn't cope and be good. I didn't like being nasty. I've tried not to see people. Anne and I have walked miles to be away from the telephone in the house. It's been a kind of slow-burning hell."
For years, in opposition, or the world was in opposition to him, and what they said about him wasn't fit to print, and what he said about them wasn't fit to print either. And this went on for so long that it sort of gave him a bitterness about life, which is understandable and excusable.
Why do you think he engendered so much controversy?
Because he's too good a painter. People like painting to be pretty and easily comprehensible. They don't like it to be tough and hard to comprehend. And he was an absolutely uncompromising painter. He would never make it easy for anybody.
He had always had periods of depression, especially related to times when there was controversy about his work, when the public outcry and mockery, would swell up, and hard for anyone to put up with that sort of thing.
What's the function of a critic?
The function of a critic, I think, should be to put the work he is criticising into its true relationship with what other people are painting, what has been painted, rather than say, number 21 shows a rock melon cut in half, which is the kind of thing I have seen a lot of, which is balderdash as far as a useful criticism is concerned.
When you have heroes, and when cultures have heroes, they tend to want them without blemish. Colin was, in many ways, a very blemished person. He was very bitter, and who wouldn't be, having to get where he had got in the kind of society he got there in.
As a painter, I may be often more worried about you than you are of me. And if I wasn't concerned, I'd not be doing my job properly as a painter. Painting can be a potent way of talking.
Colin had a very complex personality, paradoxical aspects to it, and he was a charming, lovely, modest person, but is also quite capable of obviously flying into a rage, and also he was an alcoholic, and some of his paintings were painted while he was drunk, and I think that this, in a sense, possibly gave him that extra amount of courage that he needed to go to the places that he went to.
Colin McCahn's personality and mood darkened. He became increasingly reclusive.
I'm not finished yet,
he said at the time.
Just real buggered.
I'll be hung for a sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I am. Well, some men are made of earth and sand, and some men are made of wood. And some men feel like they're made of steel. That's all well and good. This folk's made of sterner stuff, or just short of sainthood.
The final indication that Colin had really finished as a painter was when he started to watch TV. Say this because throughout his earlier life he had a certain dread about the sheer powerfulness of the TV imagery.
He visited Sydney with my mother to attend a solo exhibition of his work, I Will Need Words, in 1984. And he went for a walk with Alexa Johnson and my mother in the Sydney Botanical Gardens. And the story goes that they went to the toilet there, and Alexa and my mother were waiting for him, and it seemed that they were waiting in the wrong place, that he managed to find another exit and to wander off and get lost. He was not found until the next day, dehydrated and very ill.
Always a drinker, the effects of alcohol brought on a mental darkness that slowly began to blot out McCahn's world. From 1982, it was clear that his career as a painter was over. In 1984, after the shock of discovering that he had Korsakoff syndrome, a kind of alcohol-induced dementia, McCahon was still not able to fully give up drinking. The disease would ultimately contribute to his death. His darker and ever more negative sentiments are evident in his last series of paintings, finished in the early 1980s. Each draw upon the text from the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. Is it possible that these words reflect the battles raging inside his mind? Was he referring to his own despair? Was he alluding to the acts of oppression taking place all over the world? Was this a warning to future generations? Right to the end, Colin McCahon has kept his audience guessing.
We had done our grieving prior to his death, when we were aware that our father had gone from us. Instead, we had this person who was actually reverting to a dependent childhood state. And I can remember going with him to hang out washing, and him handing me the pegs and thinking, this is so sad, because when my own children, as 2-year-olds or toddlers, were handing me pegs, they were learning about the world and describing colours, and they were growing and learning from this activity and counting, whereas for him it was something else. It was a reversion away from reason and intelligence.
The reason why the Ecclesiastes one seems so bleak is because Colin is still coming to terms that these are probably the last paintings he is going to produce. The death of the mind is coming closer a reality of the death of the body. This I can vouch for because Colin used to regularly ring me up at this period and say, "Come round, Gordon, I'm stuck."
I considered All the Acts of Oppression is thought to be his last work.
I considered all toil and all achievement, and saw that it comes from rivalry between man and man. This too is emptiness and chasing the wind. The fool folds his arms and wastes away. Better one hand full and peace of mind than both fists full and toil that is chasing the wind. Here again I saw emptiness under the sun, without son or brother, toiling, endless, yet never.
The painting, I considered All the Acts of Oppression, was not to see the light of day until after Colin McCahon's death in 1987, at the age of 68.
These paintings, I think they do pose a most incredible, almost an unutterable bleakness, a kind of total bleakness where he believes that perhaps there is no God, or that if there is a God, even worse, that God is a being of terrible malice, of unutterable malice. He's evil, in other words, and that this universe was created by a kind of evil demiurge, and that there's no hope in anything. Writing, philosophy, laughter, wine, that's something one can't help but think is biographical in his case. So everything is without hope.
What I would hope is that we can come to understand those works in much broader terms than just, well, McCahon in the end decided that he'd gotten it all wrong. Maybe I just don't want to believe that.
But even then, he still paints. He doesn't just jump off the Harvard Bridge, he's still painting, so there's still a positivity. He's dipping a white brush into white paint and putting it down onto the black canvas, so still, even in a state of despair, it's important to him to communicate.
There was always doubt, and that was the exciting part, because having to doubt meant he was always exploring.
We don't know. We cannot know because of my father's state of mind, because he had lost so much ability to think due to this result of alcoholism. But whether he had felt himself to be losing that ability to continue with his work and then had put that down as an act of finality or not, it seems odd that it was face down and lying there on the floor. And so it seems like a closing of a book or a closing of a chapter somehow.
One thing that I think is vitally important, and not enough people understand, that you have to work flat out. And the faster you work, the more likely you are to produce a good end result. And the long time it takes often to produce a painting, and it is a long time, even in the ones that look as if they're dashed off, is spent in looking at them. And this going over and going over, I think, is absolutely essential. But it must be stopped at the right point. You must know exactly when to stop. Otherwise you squeeze out all the feeling that you may have had originally.
Colin McCahon, thank you very much.
Play it straight, gonna be a question of faith. Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I am. No, he's never gonna play it safe. Gonna be a question of faith. Might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. Fix your eyes on the great I am.